All right, good morning once again. If you're just joining us, welcome to Metropole TV's Business AM. My name is Shaban, and we have a couple of minutes left, maybe 25 minutes. And with me, joining me on set is Professor Cavince, Adhere, who's a researcher and analyst for Kenya-China relations. A very good morning.
Good morning.
We want to discuss the U.S.-China trade war. This is a topic that has been discussed by many, and it's been trending for a number of months, but it started way back in 2017. Now, Professor, I'd like us to start with the direct effect of the trade war, as seen by many analysts, is that the global prices will rise, thus slowing down productivity of global economy. Now, in which sectors in Kenya, in the Kenyan economy, are we set to see a drastic rise in prices with this following the U.S.-China trade war?
First of all, good morning, Nina, and thanks for having me here. I would like to make one clarification before we start. I'm not a professor.
Oh, sorry about that.
I'm Mr. Cavince,
okay.
Secondly,
those are good wishes, though.
It's okay.
Yes.
It comes.
Okay.
So I'm a researcher and analyst, basically, of Africa's international relations with a focus on China-Africa relations.
All right.
So I'm glad to be here this morning to just help each other understand this topic of trade war going on currently between the United States and China. As you rightfully mentioned in your introduction, the trade war between China and US can be traced very seriously to 2017 when President Trump took office. I think it's important to give our viewers some background so that we understand when we come to how it impacts on Kenya, they have an understanding of how things work in the international system and how perhaps it relates to us locally.
Yes.
So here's what the President of the United States did. There was an argument that the US was losing export market to China, that a lot of offshoring was happening in China, and therefore Americans were not getting businesses. So most of the big American companies were doing their businesses in China and re-importing the products to US. So the President of the United States thought, well, it would be a good idea, in his view, to limit the going out policy of American companies, if you like, who were basically doing business in China and then re-exporting the finished products into the US market. But the war extended beyond competition into allegations of intellectual property theft, the ideas by US companies that the President Trump felt or was being infringed on by the Chinese organizations and companies. And so there was this increased stance by the US to slap tariffs on a number of Chinese products getting into the US market. And as you know, in international system, that would certainly attract reactionary measures from Beijing.
Of course.
So China also slapped tariffs on a number of US products getting into China.
It became a tit for tat.
So it became a tit for tat.
Yeah.
Now, it's important to remember that China and US are the two largest economies in the world right now, led by China. So whatever happens in the two most dominant global economies certainly has an effect globally. And developing economies in Africa, including Kenya, are no exceptions to these implications and some of these results or countervailing measures of this kind of behavior by the leading economies. So coming back to your question about how this is likely to impact on Kenya, certainly since development in Africa and most African economies are still very much reliant on capital flows, investment flows, economic decisions by leading economies and developed world, certainly Kenya is going to be affected. Remember that these two countries we are talking about, both China and the US, have become the most significant partners for Kenya among the developed world. So China is currently the biggest trading partner for Kenya, the biggest investor in Kenya, the biggest financier in Kenya, and the biggest constructor in Kenya.
That is about 70% to China.
You know, so the fact that the Chinese economy is being impacted by the tariffs from the US has a direct effect on what happens in Kenya. Kenya is still relying on China and other developed economies for investments. We're still looking forward to see more of capital flows into this country. That is not going to come if economic pulse rate of China is shocked. Same to the United States. Just a few days ago, the new ambassador in Kenya indicated that Kenya is one of the most important, actually four of the most important partners of the United States in Africa. Now, what does that mean? If the economy of the US is going to slow down, chances that we're going to have these direct investment flowing from the Washington to Nairobi are going to be inhibited. And this is where now Kenyans have to begin to see the implications, because sometimes when people say there is a trade war going on between China and the US, people think it is far off, people think it's across the seas, and therefore it has no impact at home. But one vivid example that comes to mind very easily was the recent sanctions of Huawei products, by the US, when the US government decided to slap restrictions in terms of which companies can do business with Huawei. And you see, Google was one of the companies in that list that could not do business with Huawei. And immediately it brought a conversation among Kenyans in terms of the functionality of, say, Huawei devices, because they couldn't access certain apps, or those who are going to buy new.
Massive conversation, yes, it's true.
So you can see that is just one company with that kind of impact, that a lot of people are beginning to understand that, hey, if you're going to use this product from China, and there are implications with its relations with its US counterparts, then you're going to run into trouble. We're just talking about one company, and you can imagine how many companies around the world are doing that.
All right. I'd like us to delve in a bit deeper.
Right.
Now, the US goods imports from China totaled to about $539.5 billion in 2018, up 6.7%, that's 34 billion from 2017 now. This is up 59.7% from 2008. The inclination was massive. Now, U.S. imports from China are up 427% from 2001. That's the pre-WTO accession, yes. And the U.S. imports from China accounted to 21.2% of overall U.S. imports in 2018. With such a dependency on China, if U.S. changes its import source from China, are we allowed to look at how this will spiral back to the Kenyan economy based on the trade balances and flows, and how this will get to the Kenyan economy, and what specific goods and products are we looking at?
Now, you mentioned quite very important statistics about the massive evolution of trade relations between China and the US. Actually, if you went a little further, it was only $2 billion in 1979 when the two countries established diplomatic relations. Now if you look at those over $630 billion just last year, it shows you how massive that evolution has taken place. But this has taken place in the backdrop of a very cooperative environment between the two countries. Both countries represent the biggest source for external exports. Both countries represent the biggest sources for imports. It's unimaginable that that kind of evolution would have taken place if trade restrictions was the rule rather than the exception. Now, having said that, it's important to then wonder what is the likelihood of the spiral effect of this trade the spat between US and China on local economies. And if you come now to what is likely to happen, as you've mentioned, if these trade restrictions continue, we are going to see less. And we're already seeing less exports of Chinese products into the US. The Americans are also exporting less to China. What it means, it is impeding economic progress, because companies are shying away from investing. There is low investor confidence from both countries, because they're not sure which direction these restrictions are going to move. And when that happens, it lowers the investor confidence. It brings a situation where people are not sure of how to move, and that stops capital flows. That stops foreign direct investment. And in terms of products now, if you look at the relations between China and the US, basically what they do to each other, there is a lot of exports from US to China in terms of automobiles, in terms of airplanes, in terms of agricultural produce. Now, Kenya basically is a developing economy, and the trade relations between Kenya and China is completely imbalanced in terms of what we export to China. But we do import quite a bit from China.
We do.
Now, if the Chinese economy is going to catch the cold as a result of these restrictions, the potential is that what is available at home, the capacity for Chinese economy to continue being vibrant as it is, for the Chinese businesses to continue going out and doing business with places like Kenya is going to be inhabited. And if we get into that scenario, we are looking at a situation where both the US and China are going to reduce their presence in Kenya. We have already seen something to this effect in the country, by the way. If you look at the conversation around the standard gauge railway, we were doing pretty well with the implementation until recently, when there was news about no funding, although the State House came out clearly and clarified that that was not on the table. If you look at what is happening from the US since last year, there's been quite a number of cuts in terms of what the US is spending in the country, especially in the health sector. A number of projects that were run by US government are undergoing devaluation.
Yes, and actually I want us to zero in on that. Yeah. We've taken a look at the relationship between China and Kenya and how this whole US-China trade war could actually affect, it should actually trickle down to the Kenyan economy. Sure. Let's focus a bit on the US now. Kenya is not directly involved in this whole war, but the US, the United States still remains Africa's largest investor. So what does that do to the US and Kenya relationship when it comes to market trade?
Well, I think it's important to point out that international economy, the way economies operate, when there is a problem in one part of the economy, the domino effect goes into the other. Now, the US and Kenya are indeed enjoying a very vibrant relationship in terms of trade. Kenya has enjoyed very productive, I think, initiatives under AGOA to export certain products to the US, preferential treatment of products that are coming from developing economies, provided that those products do not offer direct competition to those produced within the United States. Now, if, as a result of this trade war between of China and the US, the WTO is already forecasting a very gloom future for the global economy. There is likely to be reductions. The forecast for 2019 is actually down to 3% from 6%. And that tells you just how important this scenario and conversation we're having is. Now, if the global economy is dampened, Kenya is part of the global economy. We are looking at a potential recession. And if that happens, or if it comes to that, it means that we will not be in a position to do some of the things that we do. Kenya is a developing country. Much of what we do here is dependent on our capacity and ability to attract, including foreign direct investment from these other partners, China and the US included. Not just China and the US, but these are the dominant players in the marketplace. Now, if we're looking at a situation where the US cannot be able to export more capital to Kenya, cannot be able to export more companies to Kenya in terms of foreign direct investment, it cannot support certain development agenda in terms of aid, remember? And these are the things that we're not talking about. Kenya is an aid recipient country. Much of it comes from the developing world, led by China and the US. If their economies are not working, they will not be in a position to support some of the development projects abroad. We are seeing that already happening in the US. We are seeing that already happening with China. And the question now we must ask is, should these trade restrictions continue? How will the Kenyan economy fare?
What's the way forward for the Kenyan economy? Yes.
In my view, it's a very dim future, not just for Kenya, but including other African economies. Now, the way forward for Kenya is, one, to continue pushing for open trade between countries. Of course, as a partner of the US and China, Kenya can add its voice to the need for rationality, that these countries have basically achieved the much they have done as a result of open borders, as a result of flow of innovation, as a result of flow of products. And that is good for everybody, because when countries leverage their comparative advantages to do business, it's not just those countries that benefit. The global economy gets some kind of injection of energy. And that's, for me, one of the ways that Kenya can contribute in the conversation, urging and continuously urging through multilateral programs like the WTO, that these two giants, when they fight, the guys down there, including Kenya, are going to suffer. And for us to avoid this, we must find a way
we
of
need to have alternatives.
The impact, of course. Now, the alternatives for Kenya could come, as I've said, if it's about the global economy, the two largest countries
in the world
are going to have an impact either way. So Kenya can only start thinking about how do we cushion ourselves from this. And part of it is to focus inside to look at alternative sources of funding or resources from other developed economies, which unfortunately are still going to be impacted by the trade spat between China and US. So it's very complicated. But I think for Kenya, there is also a good thing that is happening lately, which is the opening up of the African market. We are seeing recently the African countries agreed to open up the Africa Free Trade Agreement, which has now come into effect. Kenya is a critical pillar of the African economic bloc.
Thankfully.
And I think that Kenya can leverage these emerging opportunities to see how best to work within the continent. And this is not just about for Kenya, but even other developing economies. When the big boys are closing their eyes, what do we do with our open eyes?
What are we gaining?
We need to look at each other and begin to ask the question of how best do we harness the potential within ourselves to cushion our economies from this kind of possible global tailspins of trade and tariffs.
All right. Yeah. Okay, and lastly, when China manufactured goods face tariffs, are they likely to end up in a domestic market, which will in turn then curb the pace of domestic economic growth and therefore reducing export opportunities for other countries sending their goods to China? Now, given this scenario, how will Kenya be particularly creative in using the trade war between the US and China as a trade benefit?
No,
which takes us back to what we've just said, but now giving us
a very interesting question you just asked. You know, as I said, there is no winner in a trade war.
Yes.
You know, anybody who is engaging in a trade war in this century is staring at a huge potential to lose out. The US is aware of this. They're playing hardball. China is aware of this. They're playing hardball. The only reasonable ground now is to ask them to come to the negotiating table. China just released a white paper explaining its position on this, I think a couple of days ago. It's a good step, and they are saying we are open to talks. And we expect the United States to come down from the moral high ground, if you like, and engage in these consultations. And they're talking about consultations that are beneficial, consultations that are sustainable, consultations that are inclusive, which is a very good step. Now, for the African economies, including Kenya, when this spat is going on, what options do we have? And we've touched on it a little bit earlier. I think what we now need to do is to focus in strengthening our internal capacity. Yeah, Kenya is still a net importer of products. We're not doing a lot in terms of export.
Exporting, yes.
And this is because of weak industrial base. We still don't have enough industries doing this. Kenya does not have enough capital to engage in the kind of investments that can turn around the country. But I think with the goodwill, even with the investors, local investors, we are seeing Kenyan investors coming on board and saying, hey, we can do this as a country.
Yeah.
We are seeing emergence of African transnational investors. You know, African companies are willing to invest in other African countries. This is a good step, and Kenya should cast the net wide in terms of attracting some of these venture capitalists and investors who are interested in putting some money in our economy so that we give value to our population. We don't want to leave people in a situation where we are in the goodwill of two leading economies. We have to find alternatives. Each country is looking out for its own population. I think for me at this point in time, it's critical to understand that Kenya has a responsibility to work with colleagues, to work with like-minded countries in the region and in Africa in terms of managing some of the debilitating effects of this trade war between the US and China.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that. That was a very in-depth analysis when it comes to the US-China trade war and how it trickles down to Kenya and even affects our economy. As Cavince Adhere, who is a researcher and analyst for the Kenya-China relations, has said, the best way for Kenya and all other African countries is to come up with alternatives. Lazima hapa tuchanuke.
Kabisa.
We need to open our eyes and look at the alternatives of how, what are we going to gain from this. Now, my name is Nina Shaban. Thank you so much for keeping it Business AM. Thank you for keeping it Metropole TV. I'll be seeing you later on with our daily news just to bring you up to date with what is taking place around the world when it comes to matters business. So don't go anywhere. We have more programming that is lined up for you right here on Metropole TV. Please do enjoy the rest of your day.